Welcome back to Roots Music History. On this channel, we talk about the stories behind songs, legends, and artists, and we also talk about new up-and-coming artists in a playlist series called Roots Music History in the Making. But on today's episode, we are talking about the story behind Don McLean's iconic song, American Pie. There's so many interpretations out there of people trying to dissect the song and every single lyric. I've spent hours listening to interviews of Don McLean. I've watched all of the documentaries. I even went onto the newspaper archives and found all of the old newspaper clippings, trying to put everything together. I really believe that I have a comprehensive chronological script that I can give you today of his entire journey as a young boy all the way up through the moment that he wrote the song. So without further ado, let's dig up the roots of Don McLean's American Pie. Don McLean was born in 1945. He grew up in a small house in New Rochelle, New York. New Rochelle is just shy of 20 miles away from New York City, and in the 1950 census, it had a population of just under 60,000 people. His sister was 14 years older than him. His mother and father had his sister when his mother was 25 and his father was 26. So needless to say, Don could have been a surprise by the time they had him. His mother was 38 and his father was 39. His parents recall that by age 5, he was already showing a tremendous love of music. He was always asking his parents to put on records and play the radio. Now, by the time Don was ready to go to school, he was suffering from very bad asthma. While all of the other kids would be out playing recess, Don was often back in a classroom or sitting on the sidelines having an asthma attack. Because of this, he developed differently than the others. In elementary school, he started writing poems and listening to more and more music, and by the time he reached junior high, he realized he really loved rock and roll and folk music. When Don became a teenager, he kind of started to think to himself, well, maybe I could be that cool. I could do that. Why not? And that's when he decided he wanted to learn how to play the guitar. Now, there was a little store on Main Street in New Rochelle, New York, called the House of Music. All the way through Don's school years, he would go to the House of Music and purchase records. He loved bands like Buddy Holly and the Crickets, the Weavers. When Elvis came onto the scene, he also started buying a lot of Elvis records. But eventually, he wanted to learn how to play music himself. So one day, he went to the House of Music, and instead of buying records, he bought himself his very first guitar. It was a Harmony F Hole with a sunburst finish. His sister decided to buy him voice lessons one year. These voice lessons would have a very unexpected but positive impact on Don's life because these voice lessons taught him something very important. They taught him breath work. With this breath work, Don was able to learn how to control his asthma. So as he made his way through his junior high years, he was able to start doing things like biking and walking and jogging, and of course, singing. With these breathwork techniques, Don was able to begin to live a normal life. At this point, his father said to him, "Son, I want you to start working." Don was only maybe 13 years old, but he got a job as a paperboy. Of course, being a paperboy, you have to be able to physically ride the bike around the neighborhood and throw newspapers, but this was something that Don could do after having those voice lessons. He worked for the Standard-Star, which was the newspaper in New Rochelle, New York, and he says he loved the romance of being the person to throw the newspaper on the front porch. He just felt very rewarded with this job, like he was the paper boy. "I'll have your paper for you tomorrow, sir." He really enjoyed that. The way it worked back then, the newspaper company would bring the newspapers to the newspaper boy's front porch very, very early in the morning, and they would be stacked up and tied together with some twine. In the process of untying the newspapers and opening them up and then kind of folding them over again, he had to open up the paper. So oftentimes he would open it up and kind of thumb through, reading about what the news was that day. Now, this is something that confused me in the Paramount Plus documentary. They did a wonderful documentary. It's very, very good. Don't get me wrong. But it does skip around a lot, and this just baffled me because I do have access to a software that gives you old newspaper clippings. They made it seem like in the documentary, it was front page news, and it shows the front page saying that these kids died in this plane crash and that Buddy Holly was one of them, and it shows Buddy Holly's face. Now, I dug through the newspaper archives to no end. I cannot find anywhere a front page newspaper story saying that these 3 people died in this plane crash in Iowa. Now, in the documentary, he's got the Standard Star bag. It says the Standard Star on the newspaper headline, But the Standard Star newspaper from February 4th, 1959 had a front page article about 60 people dying in a crash. And it wasn't until page 20 that it mentioned in a small portion of the page the 3 singers who died in the plane crash in Iowa. It doesn't even have Buddy Holly's photo. The fact that Don even saw this is kind of impressive. And also, he had to have been reading the newspaper. He had to have been thumbing through it, which says a lot about him as a person. And this is going to start making more and more sense as the story goes on. But it just seems like Don was always the type of child who was very in tune with the world. He did develop differently than other people. You know, other kids were not waking up at 5 in the morning, reading the newspaper, and even caring that these 3 rock singers had died. I will say the local newspaper in Mason City, Iowa, this was their first page story. This was their cover story on their newspaper, actually on February 3rd, 1959. But no, the Standard Star, the paper that Don McLean would have seen on February 4th, 1959, did not have this as the cover story. It was a small portion on page 20. Don was he says, borderline traumatized by this story because Buddy Holly was his guy. That was who he was listening to over and over and over. He would take those accompanying notes on Buddy Holly's records and just read them over and over and over. So he was completely immersed in Buddy Holly's music. He compares that feeling to losing a loved one or breaking up with someone who you loved deeply. That's how he felt about Buddy Holly's death. Don also never says that he saw it on the front page. He says, I opened up the newspaper and I saw the story. So I really believe he had to thumb through page 20. He remembers going to school and telling all of the other kids that Buddy Holly had died in a plane crash, and even more upset that nobody seemed to care. I also think it was isolating for him to go to school and not have anyone else feel the same emotions he was feeling. I'm 99% sure they photoshopped that entire footage for that documentary, which is kind of silly because the fact that it was just a small story of the newspaper versus front page news means everything. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. One of the reasons he wrote American Pie was to keep Buddy Holly's memory alive. He says, even if it's 20 years after I wrote American Pie and somebody listening to it thinks, who was Buddy Holly? What was Buddy Holly's music? And goes and looks up Buddy Holly and listens to Buddy Holly, then mission accomplished. Now, while Don really loved Buddy Holly and the Crickets, he also loved the Weavers. His mother and father are observing all of this. They are seeing what an impact music is having in their son's life. And while they supported it, they were also a little worried that music might be consuming him a little bit too much. They wanted to make sure that he had his priorities straight and that he prioritized his schoolwork. At one point, Don and his father took a vacation to Washington, D.C., and when they got back, Don started having premonitions. He started to get this overwhelming feeling that his father was going to die. He couldn't explain it. There was no reason for it. His father was not sick. His father was in his mid-50s. Very healthy. But one day, Don went into the kitchen and said to his grandmother that he thought his father was going to die. And his grandmother just kind of looked at him and said, don't be ridiculous. Don't be silly. Of course he's not going to die. Now, later that week, his mother went out of town and his report card was scheduled to come in the mail. Don knew he wasn't doing well in school. He was spending a lot of time playing music. So he was a little nervous. This report card was coming, and he was even more nervous his mother wasn't there, because anyone who has ever gotten into trouble with their father knows it's always better if your mom is there. She kind of like diffuses the situation sometimes. But his mom was not there, and the report card was coming. The report card ends up coming in the mail, showing that Don is failing his classes. His father was extremely upset. Not just upset, but deeply concerned. His father expressed this in the form of anger. His father ends up laying into him about his bad grades, saying things, like, what is going to become of you? You have to learn how to study. You have to prioritize school. You're spending too much time on music, the whole 9 yards. So Don and his father have this fight. Don ends up going to sleep angry, and so does his dad. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, Don wakes up to his father coming into his room. His father says he's already called the emergency services, and he's got his hands around his chest, and he's crying. Don doesn't really know what to do. His mother isn't there, and it's just him and his dad. So he waits for the ambulance to come. His dad is just sitting there in pain, but his dad is okay. And the ambulance comes and the paramedics come. They put his dad on a stretcher and start taking him downstairs. And the last thing Don remembers is his father looking up at him and smiling. Don really thought it was going to be okay. His dad was in good hands now. He was going to go to the hospital and everything was going to be fine. So Don went back to sleep, was asleep for maybe 2 hours when someone else entered his bedroom, but it wasn't his father. It was his uncle. And he remembers his uncle said to him, "There's some bad news for you, Donnie. Your father died tonight." He says he cried for over 2 years. And again, he also felt very alone in these feelings. For the next 2 years, Don would cry and go through grief and really channel his grief through music. He decided he really wanted to kick it into high gear and make it in the music industry. It kind of reminds me of the story of Rick Hall with Fame Studios in Muscle Shoals, Alabama. Rick Hall lost his new bride, they had just been married, in a terrible crash. He also lost his father in a tractor accident. Rick Hall ended up being so overwhelmed with grief, he ended up living in his car for a period of time before deciding to start a production company. That production company would become Fame Studios, by the way. I mean, that's a whole story in itself. If you want to see the whole Roots documentary on that, go ahead and click the link that's going to come up on the screen, but I will also put the link in the description below. The story of Rick Hall is absolutely incredible, and his son, I think it was his son, actually commented on the YouTube video. It's really cool, so go check it out. But it's a similar situation here where Don is just overwhelmed with grief and is channeling all of it into something productive, into trying to make it in music. Now, his father really wanted him to get an education, but at this point in time, Don's like, I don't want to go to school. I want to do music. He actually went through the public phone book and found the home phone numbers for a few of the musicians in the area who were successful at what they were doing. He knew he needed a mentor, and he was doing everything possible to get one, to the point of literally calling them at home. He tried calling Fred Hellerman, who was an original member of the Weavers. Now, Fred was much older than Don when Don was calling him. Don was about 16 years old. Fred was in his mid-30s. Fred wasn't answering the phone. Don was also writing to Pete Seegar. Pete Seegar never responded to his letters. One day he's going through the public phone book. He's calling more people. He decides to call Eric Darling. Eric Darling played for the Weavers and knew Fred Hellerman. Eric Darling actually answered the phone and spoke to Don McLean. Don told him he was a musician and he wanted to learn from him, how much he loved him, this and that. Eric said, "Sure, well, why don't you come visit New York City and we can meet up?" So they did. They ended up being totally kindred spirits, totally hit it off. Eric Darling ends up introducing Don McLean to Fred Hellerman, and it ends up being through this connection with Eric Darling and Fred Hellerman that Don ends up getting his very first studio session. Now, soon after meeting Eric Darling and all of this, Don is 18 years old, and his mother really wants him to go to college. Not only does his mother want him to go to college, but, Don is also remembering that was the fight that he had with his father before his father died. Some of his father's last words were, "What is going to become of you if you don't get an education?" He ended up enrolling at Villanova University. He was only there for 4 months, but during his time there, he ended up befriending a man named Jim Croce, which I think is also kind of one of those full circle moments, because Don has struggled so much. He says, especially after his father's death, he became acutely aware of the passage of time. That's something he was talking about a lot. So I can't help but wonder if the friendship that Jim Croce had with Don McLean played any role in Jim Croce's writing of the song Time in a Bottle. But in his time at Villanova, not only did he befriend Jim Croce, but he also witnessed a very pivotal moment in American history. There was a moment where he was standing right outside of the school, and he witnessed all of the students running out of the school, evacuating the area and going towards the cafeteria. Well, it wasn't a cafeteria. It was more like a little food shop. It was where people would go to eat. There was food there, like buffet style. It was called the Pie Shop. There's an interview, and it's not until I think 2021 with Dan Rathers. He actually puts together how the Pie Shop, the Pie Shop, if that played any role in the song American Pie. Don laughs and says absolutely not, and that's the first time he's heard that. They all ran to this place called the Pie Shop, where there was a TV. It was the only television on campus. So all of the students were running to the television, spreading the news that Kennedy had been shot. The death of Kennedy triggered Don in a way that was much different than the rest of the country. He describes it as a very weird feeling because suddenly the entire country was in mourning in the same way that he had been in mourning for the last couple of years over his father's death. And the death of Kennedy really triggered him in remembering his father's death and remembering the death of Buddy Holly. And again, this whole concept of time is just haunting Don. It all becomes too much for him. He ends up leaving Villanova. He says, I just couldn't get away from the thought of, how am I using my time? Every day that I wake up could be my last day. Am I using each day the way I want to be using it? So he makes the decision to leave school and to pursue music. But this is a very hard decision for him to make because he knows how important an education was for his father, and he doesn't want to let his father down. So even though he drops out of Villanova, he ends up going home and enrolling in the local college that's right by his house, Iona College, and taking night classes there while he focuses on his music full-time during the day. This time, Don was being very strategic about his approach to his music. He got a management company and started actually getting gigs and playing in local venues. In July of 1967, Don is a few years into his studies at Iona when he's reading the newspaper and comes across a 1-inch, very small advertisement that says that Pete Seegar is actually playing about an hour away from New Rochelle in a town called Garrison, right off of the Hudson River. The advertisement literally said, Pete Seegar sings for Hudson River Sloop. Now, the whole concept of this, Pete Seegar was very upset that the Hudson River was becoming more and more polluted with every year that passed. So Pete Seegar's dream was to build a sloop, very similar to the beautiful sloops that used to go across the Hudson River in the 18th and 19th centuries. He thought, if I can build a beautiful sloop that will bring tourists in, it'll bring locals in, it will remind people of the value of the Hudson River, and maybe we can draw some attention to this pollution issue. So Pete Seegar had this vision, and this was one of the first concerts that was part of this vision, to tour up and down the Hudson River and raise money to build the boat. Well, Don sees this ad and is very excited. He loves going to live music, and he also loves Pete Seegar. Like I said earlier, he had been writing to Pete Seegar since junior high school, basically like love letters, fan letters to Pete Seegar. Maybe the equivalent of slipping into somebody's DMs on Instagram now, just like all the time though. Just being like, I love you. Oh my God, so cool. So Don borrows his mother's car and drives an hour out to the Hudson River Valley. He finds a castle on a hill called Osborne's Castle, and that's the event venue where Pete Seegar was playing. He says there were only about 200 to 300 people there, and it was a very small stage. It was just like a wooden plank stage with one microphone. And at one point during the show, Pete Seegar puts down his guitar to take a little break, and Don goes right on up and introduces himself. This is what I love about Don. It's funny to me because it's something I would do. Just go up and be like, hi. He just goes up. He's like, hi, I'm Don. He says, my name is Don. I'm the one who has been writing you for the last decade. And it's funny because Pete Seegar actually knows exactly who he is. He's read his letters. He never responded, but he just kept getting them. They end up being somewhat kindred spirits as well. They definitely hit it off. Don McLean was very likable, and Pete actually invited Don to play with him on some of his concerts. This was a huge break for Don. Don had only been playing local venues in the New Rochelle area, maybe branching out a little bit, but he really didn't have any connections or traction yet. I mean, he did have his management company, but this was a big deal for him. Don actually moves from New Rochelle to the Hudson River Valley area, and he starts playing with Pete Seegar at these benefit concerts. You would have thought that Don McLean would have dropped out of school at this point, moving away from New Rochelle to the Hudson River Valley. He is also moving away from Iona College, where he is taking his night classes. But Don was very close to graduating, and he knew that it was important to his father and his mother that he finish this and he get a degree. Even if he didn't think he was going to use the degree, this is a big deal that a lot of people don't really talk about. The fact that he did not drop out of school when this incredible opportunity came to him. It's almost like He fulfilled his father's dream of finishing school. And then once he did, and once he got his diploma, it's almost like his father guided him to fulfill his dreams at that point. Because after he got his bachelor's of business administration in 1968, a lot of really remarkable things started happening for Don McLean. For the first year and a half after getting his college degree, he was just spending a lot of time touring and singing with Pete Seegar. He was able to sign a 3-album deal with a record label, and he was given all of these incredible opportunities to be performing around the area with Pete Seegar, to be in Pete Seegar's network with all of those songwriters, and he was also recording in the studio. Now, 1969 was a hard year for Pete Seegar, though. After Pete Seegar built his sloop, he started to really get on this anti-American train. Don McLean even admits, he's like, yeah, Pete Seegar was a communist, but he was a really talented musician. After he built his sloop, people would actually come and deface the sloop and throw eggs at the sloop and bottles at the sloop and just harass Pete Seegar. But Don McLean was learning a lot from him. He was a mentor to him for the music industry, for sure. And while Don McLean was writing the music to his album Tapestry, there were riots going on outside his door because of all of the civil unrest in the country at that time. Don McLean ended up releasing the album Tapestry, and it started to get a lot of traction. He was now headlining shows in local venues and at colleges because of that album. Now, it didn't take off in the same sense that American Pie took off, not by any means, but it didn't do badly. It did pretty well enough that he was able to move up a little bit in his music career. A few months before the song American Pie came to Don McLean, Pete Seegar took Don and a few other people to the Newport Folk Music Festival. Now, Don says this was one of the highlights of his entire life. He says everyone was there. Van Morrison, James Taylor, the list goes on and on. But more importantly, to Don, the Everly Brothers were there. And he knew that the Everly Brothers knew Buddy Holly really well. He watched the Everly Brothers play, and it was an incredible show. After the show, he just had to go up and introduce himself. Says, "Hi, my name is Don. I know that you knew Buddy Holly." He says, "What can you tell me about him and about what happened?" And Phil Everly said, "That's right, Buddy and I were really good friends." He tells Don the whole reason Buddy Holly was on that plane in the first place was because Buddy wanted to get to the Missouri location early so that he could do his laundry. And this really impacted Don because Don thought, this man died because of dirty laundry. All of the emotions just start coming back to Don. He's remembering the moment he saw the story in the newspaper. He's remembering that deep feeling of grief, which reminds him of his father and reminds him of his father's death. It all comes back to him. And it's interesting because, this song had always been there, but it just seems like Don wasn't ready for the song yet. But now he has already released an album. He's signed a 3-album deal with a label, so he knows he has a second album that he's got to produce. He's also had the experience of being with Pete Seegar and with Pete Seegar's network and learning the mechanics and the business side of the music industry. Don gets back to Phillipstown, and at this time too, he's deciding he wants to move. He was just getting tired of the Pete Seegar network and the anti-American rhetoric that was coming out of Pete's mouth every day. Don was religious. He believed in God and he believed in his government. It was also hard to record in the Northeast. It was much easier to record in Nashville. He had this deal with the label. So he's deciding that he wants to move to Nashville. But it was when he was still in Phillipstown, he sits down one day and says these words just kind of came to him. It was like a genie in a bottle. And within 60 seconds, he had written the whole first part of American Pie all the way through to the lyrics, "The Day the Music Died." After he writes about half of the song, he moves from the Northeast to Nashville, Tennessee, where he would finish the song. So many people have tried to dissect the lyrics. Don actually admits that the whole concept of Bye Bye, Miss American Pie came from one of Pete Seegar's songs that he would sing that was kind of going like, bye, 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 bye. And so that was one song. I can't remember the name of that song, but that was one song that Pete Seegar sang that was just like, bye, 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 bye. But Pete Seegar had another song that was called The Preacher and the Slave. And the chorus to The Preacher and the Slave went, You will eat by and by in that glorious land above the sky. Work and pray, live on hay. You'll get pie in the sky when you die. That was one of the songs that Don would have been singing over and over and over with Pete at these concerts. So this song was kind of in him. Now, Buddy Holly also had a song called That'll Be the Day. He had that song back when he was with the Crickets. And the lyrics to that song went, well, that'll be the day when you say goodbye. Yes, that'll be the day when you make me cry. You say you're gonna leave. You know it's a lie, 'cause that'll be the day that I die. So I really, truly believe that it's the Pete Seegar songs in combination with that song from Buddy Holly. That was one of his most famous songs. That was kind of living and resonating and reverberating in Don McLean's soul and ended up coming together and coming to the surface in American Pie. A transcript of those very first lyrics all the way through, the day the music died that he had written in Phillipstown ended up just selling at an auction for $1.2 million. Although the song is written about Buddy Holly's plane crash, Don McLean says he really wasn't prompted to write the song until after the death of Kennedy. The death of Kennedy is actually probably what prompted the song, if you really want to get technical about it, because even though Buddy Holly had died, he had moved on from that. Even though his father had died, he had moved on from that. But Kennedy dying, that's what caused him to reassess his own life. That's what caused him to take the other direction. That's what caused him to say, I don't have that much time on this earth. I want to spend my time as optimally as possible. I'll focus on my music during the day and pursue my dreams. And then I'll just do school at night instead of going to school for the entire day and then doing, whatever a college kid does at night. And if the death of Kennedy hadn't happened and he had not been triggered in that moment, in that year, he never would have dropped out of Villanova, probably. He definitely wouldn't have tried so hard at pursuing this music career. Again, and then that whole friendship with Jim Croce and Time in a Bottle, that's what was happening because Kennedy was shot. So he actually says, if you want to argue about it, he doesn't say if you want to argue about it, but I'm like, that's the vibe. Like, if you actually want to, get technical and think about it, it was probably Kennedy's death that prompted American Pie. Now, the owners of the property where Buddy Holly's plane crashed are kind of funny. They say they had no idea the song American Pie was about this crash. He even says, we were listening to the song American Pie for years. We had no idea that it was about the crash that happened on our property until a local radio host decided to do a Buddy Holly tribute series. And part of this series was researching all about the crash and Buddy Holly and the impact that it had on people. And somehow or another, the colleague of the radio host comes across some sort of information about how American Pie is referencing the Buddy Holly crash. Now, nobody in Iowa had heard that before. I don't know if the radio host or the radio host's colleague ended up actually calling Don McLean or how they confirmed that. But somehow or another, that's how they discovered that. It ends up being broadcast on the local radio station that American Pie is about this crash. And that's when the owners of the property realize this incredible song that's been #1 on the charts and is all over the country is being sung about their property, their field where this happened. They are the location where the music died. So in that moment, the owners decided we should really do a monument and some sort of a tribute to Buddy Holly and the site where it happened. They were like, I can't believe we haven't thought of this before. People started coming from all over the country to see this location, which became this incredibly magical thing. And it's crazy because they almost never knew that the song was about that. I mean, Don McLean doesn't actually mention Buddy Holly in the song, to be fair. Other than the Paramount Plus documentary, which I thought was very good, there is another interview. It is with Dan Rathers, and it's honestly the best interview that I found. So I will link that in the description below. You can also become a Roots Music History member. I'll put the link on how to join the membership in the description. As a member, you will have access to members-only videos, which include the full interviews of people that I've interviewed for various videos, like the 619-year-old tree that is being turned into guitars. That was one of George Washington's trees. I have the full interviews with the guy who was there when that guitar was presented to Thomas Rhett. I have the interview with the guitar makers who made the bass guitars for Steve Cook, who knew Steve Cropper and Travis Vance, and he made the electric guitar for Thomas Rhett. I have the interview with the guitar maker who made the first 2 guitars ever out of the wood and his experience working with the wood. It's just really cool to watch. And it's nice that I'm able to post them so that you can see the full, raw, uncut video versus just snippets of the interview in my Roots rockumentaries. But also as a member, we go in and we read through the full newspaper articles. So the Harry Chapin video, if you've seen that, about Harry Chapin's death, I have the full newspaper articles up there from that moment. I also have the Leonard Skinner newspaper articles. And I will also be going on and putting on the full newspaper articles for this crash and the day the music died. And of course, if you like this content, don't forget to subscribe and hit the thumbs up button. You really have no idea how much that helps. And let me know in the comments below if you would like the next Roots rockumentary to dig up the roots of the day the music actually died, the crash with Buddy Holly. And until then, I will see you on the next Roots rockumentary.
Hungry for the road all my life, thirsty for adventure all my youth, chasing all my